Subscribe to our YouTube channel. Click the bell icon for updates.
This is StratNews Global. I'm Amitabh, Revi, and you're watching our weekly flagship show, The Talking Point. Welcoming again from Washington, D.C., Kamran Bokhari is a Director, Analytical Development with Newlines Institute. He's also a National Security and Foreign Policy Specialist with University of Ottawa Professional Development Institute. Bokhari Saab, thank you for your time.
Thanks for having me. And just to clarify, it's Newlines, not Newslines.
Yeah, my mistake there. Newlines Institute. Also from London, Andrew Small. He's a Transatlantic Fellow with the German Marshall Fund of the United States and a Senior Political Fellow with the European Council for Foreign Relations, and has also written a book, the Pakistan Axis. I'll make another mistake and say Nexus. It's quite different, but anyway. Andrew, thank you for your time.
Very happy to join you. Thanks for having me on.
Just getting, the latest developments in your that and what's happening in Afghanistan. We've seen, the High Council for National Reconciliation chairperson Abdullah just tweeting pictures of meetings, and you see, the array of people who were involved, mostly in the Northern Alliance or anti-Taliban, whether it's Sayyaf, whether it's Dostum Senior, whether it's Khalili, Mohaqqiq. One of the things that has been talked a lot about is that the Afghan political elite has not been united in the fight against Taliban. Dr. Bokhari?
Yes, look, I mean, that is the problem. That has been sort of the challenge of the United States is to how do we get a coherent anti-Taliban alliance. And the weakness of the anti-Taliban camp, the internal divisions, not being on the same page, having conflicting interests, that's been a huge issue for the United States all throughout the last 20 years. And that's something that the Taliban have actually, exploited, benefited from. And this is why they're making inroads. Now, notice that the Taliban influence and presence is in areas that used to be at one point in time back in the 90s under the control of the Northern Alliance. The minorities, the Uzbeks, the Tajiks, the Hazara, and other communities. They've built these inroads at the tactical level because of discontent with these, top leadership, these regional figures, the warlords. And they've exploited that and made inroads, and this is where we are today because of the lack of coherence. In many ways, there is the idea of what it means to be an Afghan is contested not just between the Taliban, a view of what Afghanistan should be, but also because of the lack of what an Afghan national mainstream looks like.
Andrew, just coming to you again, these are just developments that we are hearing of now. Kehtani, who is the special advisor to the Qatar foreign minister, is in Delhi, we hear, and having talks with our ministry officials. Will probably be meeting the foreign secretary tomorrow as well. Qatar majorly involved in the Doha negotiations there. But curiously, Kehtani is the person who let the cat out of the bag, so as to speak, though India and Pakistan haven't really confirmed that officially, that there was some kind of back channel talks between India and Pakistan going on, and Qatar had something to do with it, if not facilitating it. Just your comments on that.
I mean, there is intensifying diplomacy taking place around all of these developments right now. There are different channels being opened up to different actors at the moment that may not have been opened up in the past. As with the developments that you were commenting on in Afghanistan proper, this is extremely fluid. fast-moving crisis situation now on the diplomatic front. So I expect there'll be a number of these developments, openings, people looking to reach out to various parties that they may not have been as actively in normal times. Without having details on what's going on in these meetings, I can't really comment beyond that.
Yeah. I just want to get, like you're saying, a lot of flux in the region, not just in Afghanistan. Now reports that the first provincial capital, that's of Nimroz, has fallen. And off before we started this, we were talking to Mr. Bokhari, who was pointing out that, the Taliban is quite strong in that area. But just the region, Dr. Bokhari, and we wanted to talk about China now. China has had contacts with the Taliban even during 1996 to 2001, then 2019, there were pictures that emerged of Mullah Baradar in Beijing. Just last month, again, you had very publicized pictures of Wang Yi and other Chinese officials meeting the Taliban. How do you see China, Dr. Bokhari? Because there are reports which are suggesting some kind of a quid pro quo is being worked out here, security for China or counterterrorism assurances and economic development or the extension of the CPEC or BRI for the Taliban. Dr. Bokhari?
Yeah, I mean, Amitabh, look, the Chinese have in my opinion, the Chinese have very little interest inside Afghanistan. They don't want to get into this hornet's nest. They were very content on having the United States do the heavy lifting for the past 20 years because that allowed them to develop business opportunities, particularly the BRI, all around Afghanistan. So CPEC is well known in Pakistan. A little less known is the BRI network that is being developed in Central Asia on China's western flank. And then recently, we heard about, at least the Chinese officially stated that they have an intent to put as many as $400 billion into a transportation corridor in Iran. Yeah. So this is the Chinese interest. Now, all of a sudden, the United States says, okay, we're done and we're pulling out of Afghanistan. That really upsets the Chinese calculus because they were really hoping that there would be some semblance of security being managed by the United States, and therefore they didn't have to worry about it. Now they have to worry about it, and they are now trying to do coordinate with their Pakistani allies. They're trying to coordinate with the Iranians, with the Russians, with the Central Asian states. And as you mentioned, even directly talking to the Taliban. The Chinese have never deployed a multi-divisional force in a third country ever. Yeah. And so that's not something that you can develop as a capability on the fly. So what is going to happen is that the Chinese are going to try to work with all these various actors, including the Taliban, to try and see if whatever happens in Afghanistan stays in Afghanistan and does not spill over and undermine Chinese interests. We're already seeing attacks on Chinese workers in Pakistan. And so the Chinese are deeply worried about this situation.
Sure. Andrew, if you want to come in on that, especially, sure. It's not just China, even India was, the US has said it publicly, has been working on the back of American security in the area.
I mean, on the Taliban relationship, China's been dealing with the Taliban, as Dr. Bokhari said, since they were in power last in Afghanistan. And as you put it in the question, the security dimension of this has really been to the fore in the meetings that have taken place with the Taliban. Back in the turn of the millennium, when you had the Chinese ambassador to Pakistan meeting with Mullah Omar, the ask was essentially the same as you have from the Chinese today, which was that the Taliban should not allow safe haven in the country for any Uyghur militant groups, whether you call them ETIM or as the current group calls themselves TIP. And that's been a pretty, I mean, if you get the readout of the meetings that have taken place, the sort of more secret meetings that used to take place in Pakistan, and then the more public meetings, and this was very much the most public meeting, the one where with the pictures with Wang Yi quite recently, it's been the same ask essentially that the Chinese have, but with now greater urgency. And you saw the statements from the Taliban spokesperson relating to this even before the public meeting took place. I think the concern on China's part, exactly as Dr. Bokhari says, this is not primarily about the situation inside Afghanistan itself. It's about the spillover into neighboring countries. It's attacks on soft targets outside Afghanistan, which we've already been seeing intensifying in Pakistan just in recent weeks, to take the most obvious example. It's less about even Xinjiang or attacks on the Chinese mainland, which are pretty implausible. But you do, of course, as we've already been talking about, see control of territory very close to Central Asia, and in one way, less consequentially, directly on Chinese borders. I mean, it is a closed border. There's no realistic scenario that involves anything going on the Afghan-Chinese border. But the reason that you've seen some level of security presence by the Chinese on, for instance, the Tajik border, is that this has been the kind of through flow route for some of the kind of weapons and other goods and things that have moved into China. So you have some Central Asia related border concerns, but this insistence that China has, which is a breaking of links with any of the Uyghur groups, is something that's always then been very difficult for them to gain any adherence to from the Taliban. They've formally committed to doing this, but you still see, of course, a number of these individuals operating in territory that the Taliban control. From the Taliban's perspective, of course, they do certainly want economic support from China. China's diplomatic role has always been extremely important to them as well, particularly when it comes to sanctions at the UN Security Council. But I mean, we are in a very different state now. They've been dealing with each other for virtually 20 years. They know the two sides know what the other wants. But now there is considerably greater scrutiny on China's part with the advances that the Taliban are making on what the Taliban will actually do to deliver on some of the demands that the Chinese are making. And that will have a huge impact on the quality and scope and depth of the relationship that China actually ends up having with the Taliban.
The scope of the relationship, Dr. Bokhari, I mean, there are some analysts who look at it in terms of either the US or even India, for that matter, wishing that the Chinese get dragged into the quagmire. There's talk about the void that the Americans are leaving in Afghanistan, and the Chinese may look to fill that. But as Andrew is pointing out, they're not going to move in the manner that other countries have, right? I mean, they're going to be they're looking for their interest, which is counterterrorism in whatever manner. But do you think the CPEC or the BRI is something that they'll be looking at this moment when Afghanistan is not stable?
Yes, I mean, that is their primary investment and has been, or the investment vehicle, and their ability to maintain their economic standing in the post-2008 financial crisis world, where, for the longest time, the Chinese economy has grown, and the Chinese Communist Party's imperative of maintaining full employment or near full employment was met by exports. And when after the 2008 crisis, that was the first major jolt to global appetite for imports from China. And if you're so dependent on exports, then they had to find another way out. So the way out was BRI, as conceived by the current president of China. And the idea is to have Chinese companies and Chinese money do these projects so as to be able to maintain that employment imperative that I mentioned earlier. So this is very important. So if Afghanistan is now in uncertainty, and there's going to be a strategic vacuum of sorts that's going to spill over into pretty much each area that the Chinese are eyeing to do business in, then they have to do something, and they can't jump into this quagmire. And therefore, they're going to continue to work with Tehran, with Islamabad. And what I'd like to add, that what has the Chinese even more worried is that their close ally is Pakistan. And Pakistan has traditionally had the closest relationship with the Taliban. At a time when Pakistan itself is shifting in terms of this idea that the Taliban are assets, to the idea that the Taliban represent a grave danger to the security of Pakistan, a fully Talibanized military takeover, a reestablishment of the emirate, that if Pakistan is not looking at that in positive terms, and on the contrary, looking at it in very as a major threat, then that really undermines the Chinese ability to manage the situation, because the Chinese are not going to directly involve themselves. So they have to work with the Pakistanis, they have to work with the Central Asian republics, with the Russians, with the Iranians, to try and manage this situation. In other words, the levers that the Chinese have aren't all that great.
Andrew, if you want to take up on that, in terms of the Chinese will still look for stability, even if not now, in the future, before they move in economically, right? I mean, militarily, it's a no-no.
I mean, with these very kind of specific minimal exceptions, as we've seen in Badakhshan, which we think was kind of a People's Armed Police deployment, you know, some border dimension, some counterterrorism dimension, but it's unimaginable that there would be anything beyond that. I mean, they have trained in PLA and other security personnel have trained in Pakistan for scenarios that involve Afghanistan. This is an area in which, in these very minimal ways, they know that there are limited forms of involvement of a kind that we have already seen, but it's to my mind unimaginable that there would be anything seriously beyond that. And again, this will be a context in which, if anything, they're even more risk averse when it comes to any form of even limited security role, until they see how some of this shakes out. And yes, I mean, ultimately, they're very dependent on Pakistan when it comes to looking out for their interests in Afghanistan, particularly in a situation that is as complex, fast moving, and where they've had to pull most of their personnel out of the country as well. This is a context, as you've also seen in the meetings that have taken place between China and the Taliban, in which you're starting to get this additional insistence from the Chinese relating to the relations between the Afghan Taliban and the Pakistani Taliban. It did used to be that the only requests that China had on this would relate to the peace process, or they'd relate to the bilateral demands that they have vis-a-vis ETIM, TIP. But I think there are now these greater concerns, which mirror those, as Dr. Bokhari said, that we're seeing on the Pakistani side, about what the ripple effects will be in a country that they are far more concerned about in terms of their investments, their personnel, and all of these sorts of things, which is Pakistan, and to a more limited extent, given the lower possibility of that kind of spillover, Central Asia certainly as well. But I think Pakistan, in different ways, both in terms of the channels to the Taliban, the attempts to exercise influence, the concerns, the ramifications for China, Pakistan is going to be the locus point for quite a lot of this for China.
You're talking about the ripple effects. Just taking a viewer comment here from Gaurav Datta. Hey, Andrew, really enjoyed reading your book, China-Pakistan Axis. Glad to see you here. Just coming back to you, Andrew, again, before I go to Dr. Bokhari, in terms of what's happening in Pakistan itself, and you saw the attack on the workers from Dasud Dam, the Chinese workers. There was one, I don't know whether it was related, to the Balochistan Army, Freedom Army claimed that another attack. That fallout, and how does China deal with Pakistan? I mean, there were some reports saying that, the Qureshi had been summoned there soon after that. I'm not sure whether that actually happened, but how do you see that dynamic working, Andrew?
So, I mean, China's been ready when it comes to CPEC, and thanks, by the way, for the kind comment on the book. They've been ready for terrorist attacks on CPEC, on their personnel. This is not something that was in one way surprising to them. They've actually had quite a good run on CPEC in terms of the level of protection that the Pakistanis have provided has largely been effective. But now there are real concerns that the context has shifted. And it is tied in their mind to what's going on in Afghanistan as well, accurately or otherwise. The attack that you saw and that the clips are coming up on the screen. I mean, this was probably the worst terrorist attack on Chinese personnel in Pakistan that we've seen in terms of the number of killed, number of Chinese personnel killed, and this comes off the back, of course, of the attack in Quetta when the Chinese ambassador was there. We've seen another incident in Karachi. I think there are more concerns about security, probably at a higher level on China's part than at any other point since CPEC started. When all of the CPEC plans were being negotiated in the first place, this was the issue that the Chinese were particularly insistent and concerned about. But for several years, these projects were well protected. The only instance that involved Chinese personnel in Pakistan tended to be these kind of off-the-grid incidents, the religious workers in Quetta, or a guy who was cycling to Iran, things like that. These weren't attacks, successful attacks on workers on the projects themselves. And I think there have been certainly people summoned. The intelligence delegation that went over to China immediately afterwards. We've seen the head of the CPEC authority switched over in just the last couple of days as well. I think there is a lot more scrutiny on CPEC now in Beijing, and certainly it focuses on the security dimension at the moment in light of the regional picture and in light of what we've been seeing in Pakistan in recent weeks. But CPEC has been proceeding quite slowly generally under Imran Khan's government. So I think you're getting a kind of a sense on the Chinese side that there needs to be new impetus. There needs to be the whole question of how you move CPEC into the next phase needs to be revisited. I think they've been quite fed up, frankly, over the last few years. So it's a difficult spot on that. As always, the China-Pakistan has its deep underlying dimensions that mean that these are always kind of problematic wobbles rather than anything worse than that. But I think this is a slightly delicate moment at the moment. The Chinese are certainly concerned about what they're seeing right now.
Dr. Bokhari, if you want to pick up on that, and also wanted to get your views on what Iran is doing, because it's not, you've seen the Taliban delegation there as well, and in fact, it's not just them meeting the Iranians and Jawad Zarif. You had a Republic team there as well. And that was coincidentally or not on the same day that the Indian Foreign Minister Jaishankar was there on his way to Moscow. But CPEC, then China, and Dr. Bokhari, if you want to talk about Iran.
Yeah, I want to sort of tie both of these in a single thread, and which is that I think we need to be really mindful of what the political bureau of the Taliban is promising to the Chinese, promising to the Pakistanis, the Americans, the Iranians, and everybody else, and what are the actual battle space dynamics on the ground. I'll just give you an example. The province whose capital fell, Nimruz, to the Taliban, or at least has reportedly fallen to the Taliban, is on the Iranian border. And, that's the last thing the Iranians want to see, is that the Taliban take over territory near their border. Then we've seen intense fighting in Herat, another region on the Iranian border. And so it's one thing for the political leadership to say all these diplomatic niceties and promise all these things about how the Taliban have evolved, and they are now no longer, they should not be seen through the lens of the 1990s. And the world should recognize that there has been an evolution in behavior and thought. And so, there is that huge gap. So I think we really need to understand that the battle space dynamics are very different from what is being discussed in political meetings and diplomatic meetings. And so there is that huge variance. You see, and I'll come back to the Pakistani-China thing, and I'll give you an example. So look, the Taliban imperative in the battle space, the negotiating table, the politics, whatever the political bureau, whatever Mullah Brother is saying, or whatever their spokespersons are saying, is contingent on what happens in the battle space. There is intense pressure on the Taliban from all sides to come to the table, but they're resisting it because they still think they have the initiative. And they want to grab as much territory as is possible before they make that decision to come to the table, because it's only logical that any actor will negotiate from a position of strength. Now, what does that mean? That means that they need all the resources on the in the battle space to push against the Afghan National Security Forces and the allied militias of in the various regions that are fighting with the Afghan state security forces. That means that they're going to need force multipliers. It won't make a difference to them if it's TTP fighting with them, which is an anti-Pakistani Taliban group. It doesn't matter if Uzbeks fighters, foreign fighters from Central Asia. It really doesn't matter. They will want all of those, and they're not, and even Al Qaeda, and perhaps even and I can imagine the tactical arrangement where even ISIS fighters, align themselves tactically with the Taliban because it's a fluid battle space. We've seen this in Syria, and so I think that it's going to be a very, very confusing battle space because on one hand, the Chinese are promising that, the Taliban are promising the Chinese, oh, we will not do anything against your interests. And they're talking about the Uyghurs. But then you have attacks in Pakistan on the Chinese, and the Chinese are wondering and scratching their head and saying, what is going on here? And they're asking their Pakistani counterparts for answers, and the Pakistani counterparts seem to not know what is going on either. And they're sort of scratching and saying, okay, are these the Baloch? Is this TTP? Who is this? And then, of course, are these, Indian supported attacks, so on and so forth. So it's getting really, really confusing. And the same thing for the Iranians, that they have this situation where, the foreign minister says, okay, here are the members of the delegation from the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan, and here are the Taliban representatives. And look, they did a huge photo op, and it was classic information operations that we have developed influence on both sides, and we're a player here. They just took territory in your front yard, in Nimruz. So, and they're going after Herat. So, what is really going on? We really need to separate. And I really don't think that the Politburo has control over the battle space. Battle space decisions are made by local commanders based on local conditions, opportunities, threats. These are, they're based on kinetic realities and what can be achieved, what cannot be achieved. And it's really, dizzying, if you will. So I think there's a real need to separate the two out.
Andrew, if you want to comment on Iran, I mean, it's not confusing enough. Iran hosted the Taliban leaders, the Al Qaeda leaders. They have the Fatemiun brigade, which is sent to Syria, Afghan Shias. What's Iran's role in all of this?
I mean, I'll say less about Iran specifically. I'll come back to one thing on that, just briefly, actually. Then, though also on Dr. Bokhari's last point first. I mean, I think this is the huge concern that China has in particular, that they can reach some kind of political agreements with the Taliban, and then in practice, what will go on in the ground will bear very little resemblance to whatever these agreements amount to, and this has been the standing concern that they've had in any of the arrangements with the Taliban, and this was the case even when you had the level of centralized control and the level of discipline that there was outside a battlefield context. The what they saw and what they got from the Taliban the last time they were in government, when they reached these kinds of deals about the Uyghurs, was still pretty limited. It was still essentially telling them, well, you're not going to have these kind of separate camps or facilities. You have to kind of go and join up with the Central Asians, go and join the IMU or whatever. Don't embarrass us, but we're not. I mean, if you look at the expectations that China has of governments in the region when it comes to these issues with Pakistanis or the Central Asians, they expect people to be handed over. They expect people to be killed. That's what the kind of the level of demands and expectations are. They know in a certain sense that they're not really going to get that from the Taliban. They never have. They never have outside government. They didn't in government. So it does impose certain limitations on even aside from the battlefield conditions, even looking at a longer arc of what they might reasonably expect to get from the Taliban, depending on the scope of their role in a future government. They know there are going to be these limitations, and that is the big concern that China has on any of this. That regardless of the negotiations that take place in Beijing or in Doha, or the meetings that take place in Pakistan, they're very uncomfortable with what the ramifications actually are of a Taliban rise to any level of power, but particularly one in which they're not hemmed in various ways by political agreements.
A quick comment, Dr. Bokhari, on how you view India. I mean, our role has been $3.1 million in development assistance. Of course, we did give those military Mi-24 attack helicopters and smaller arms, maybe mortars and transport. But how do you see India in this? Quick comments from both of you before we end.
Yeah, no, the area that the Taliban, have been pressing hard on in Nimruz and Farah. We have to remember that the Indian Army Corps of Engineers built a road from Delaram to Saranj to connect, the Iranian border with the Garland Highway that sort of goes through, the major cities of Afghanistan, the ring road, if you will. And so there's been a lot of Indian work, training, development work, infrastructure. But as I said, and I think we mentioned this earlier in the show, that it almost seems like the Chinese and the Indians have been in the same boat. The extent to which India has been able to influence, develop intelligence contacts, develop relationships with the anti-Taliban camp, that all took place in an environment where security was being underwritten by the United States. In other words, India could not have done that if the United States was not present in Afghanistan and the United States did not topple the Taliban regime. Remember, an Indian Airlines flight was hijacked from Nepal, and it landed in Taliban-controlled Kandahar in the 90s, in 1999, and the exchange was the leader of GEM and the person who's been convicted of killing Wall Street Journal Daniel Pearl, journalist Daniel Pearl. So these are things that are not something that the Indians have forgotten, and that how does India, the challenge for India is now that the US is no longer providing that security environment, how does India continue to do business? And we saw the special envoy from the United States to Afghanistan, Zalmay Khalilzad, suggesting to the Indians not too long ago that they should open up their own negotiations with the Taliban. And those, I think we've had at least one round. I'm not privy to what was discussed, and I don't think anything made it out, and something made it out to the open sources either. But it's a situation where the Indians are also now scrambling on how to deal with this. There is the idea, on one hand, there is the threat that, okay, India's arch rival Pakistan gains far more space in Afghanistan that Pakistan can leverage against India. But then the Indians also have to factor in that the Pakistanis don't seem to have things under control either. So, which is worse? So this is a very, very uncertain time for India, as it is for the Chinese.
Andrew, last comments on India, and we started off by saying, China has seen the withdrawal of the U.S. security blanket and was scrambling. Dr. Bokhari says India is doing the same.
I mean, a couple of points. I mean, first of all, as you also began the show, we will now see as well what level of coalescing of the other forces in Afghanistan actually looks like. So that there is going to be a much more important kind of question as well in the coming phase of what that constellation amounts to during a period of time in which the Taliban have been making all of these advances, in which the US role is now receding. So there is what the kind of shape of the other actors and what the dynamics with the other actors are for India to be dealing with in the next period of time. We'll see in the coming stretch. Clearly, there is the standing question that everyone is having to deal with, which is if the Taliban become a or the dominant force in the country, then what sort of relationship to them does one have to have? And there are varying levels of distaste that virtually every other outside actor or most other outside actors have, but then have had to figure out some set of terms in which they at least have channels and exchanges and things, and that's going to be evidently an issue that India is already having to wrestle with, and that's going to be very difficult. But the one thing I would kind of caution on, and that we've kind of come back to again and again in this show, is this is not. The China-Taliban relationship is not going to be some great advance for China in any of this. There isn't going to be some great China-Pakistan-Taliban axis kind of dominating the Afghan space in a way that's going to work against Indian interest. I mean, the Chinese are extremely uncomfortable with this. To put it mildly, this is not China moving in to vacate a space or a comfortable relationship between China and the Taliban that's emerging. This is a real headache for the Chinese right now, and anyone who works on this on the Chinese side would tell you that. So I think it's concerning for all sorts of reasons from India's perspective, but I would at least stress that one of the kind of anxieties that's being flagged at the moment, I'm not sure is a well-placed one. There are extreme limitations to what one can expect between China and the Taliban, notwithstanding the relations that Pakistan and the Taliban have had on this, and notwithstanding the fact that Pakistan is able to operate and act on China's behalf in some of these dealings, hasn't changed the concerns that China has about these issues, and it is really viewing the current situation with a lot of discomfort.
Andrew Small, I absolutely appreciate your time and your experience. And just echoing what our viewers are saying to both of you, please invite Dr. Bokhari and Andrew Small more often. So we're going to impose more on your time. Andrew, thanks so much for your time. And Dr. Bokhari, as usual, it's been a pleasure.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Just a reminder to our viewers, a programming note. Next week, we have a special series on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 8 p.m. Indian Standard Time. We'll be looking in the run-up to Pakistan's Independence Day at the State of the Republic.
This is a government that was brought in by the Pakistan army and Imran Khan and his party. They share the same set of values, same set of goals.
So I think in the last 10 years, you have seen a move away from what might be called, politely, as a kind of ambivalence towards the Taliban, to a more explicit aversion to their style of politics. I think that has happened.
The only constant that appears on the political scene is the fact that the military continues to have confidence in Imran Khan. And this is only because they don't yet have any alternative.
Ahead of Pakistan's 75th Independence Day, we bring you a 3-part series on the country's state of affairs through the eyes of eminent Pakistanis. Coming up next Monday, Wednesday and Friday, only on StratNews Global.